Hi, Hayden. This is great. I am so looking forward to doing this Lenten learning together. Having gotten into Tomas Halik's book and thinking about the conversations that he's going to stimulate, and that our folks at St. Paul, as we get into the conversations, will stimulate. I'm just so looking forward to this.
Yeah, Peter, thank you. I'm feeling the same way. I think it'll be a pretty rich conversation. I think he brings a different perspective, but not one that is totally out of left field for us. And I think we'll have all kinds of things to talk about, starting right away in these two chapters.
Yeah, so. Yeah. The what he brings differently, I think, is in part because of his background. And what I know about him is that he was ordained secretly as a Roman Catholic priest in communist Czechoslovakia while he worked as a trained psychoanalyst and spent a lot of years working with drug and alcohol addiction and helping people move out of that. He's currently at the Charles University in Prague in the Czech Republic, teaches philosophy and sociology, and is, I think, the chaplain of the university, if I'm not mistaken. He won that amazing Templeton Prize in Religion in 2016, and it's kind of the Nobel Prize for Religion and Theology, I think you know. And he has some Templeton Project research going on at the Charles University. But do you know more about his background? Because I think that's part of what, it's his European perspective, it's his Catholic perspective, that in some ways just brings something different from what I'm familiar with as a Lutheran in this country.
Yeah, there's just a few things I would add. A fun tidbit that I gathered about him is that while he studied in the underground seminary, when it came time to actually be ordained, he had to be shuttled to East Germany to make that happen, which is just kind of fascinating. And then was able to come back. The situation was just a little bit better there. But backing up, his birth itself, as I understand it, the way he told it in an interview I saw, his birth actually coincides with the beginning of the communist regime there. So there's a way in which his life dovetails with that whole story, even to the extent that after the regime fell, he was so pessimistic about how quickly the changeover would be. The Pope at the time told him it would be all of a few days, and he responded, "No way, it'll be a few years." And it happened to only take about 2 weeks there. So
revolution.
Yeah. And so from what I gather, unlike we might, I think another thing that's just really different and hard to get our heads around, but important to realize, is that unlike perhaps most theologians in a United States context, Tomáš seems to be widely known and respected in the Czech Republic. He actually had considered, well, others wanted him to make a run for president early on in their life as a republic, which he initially decided not to, and over time was open, and then now again seems not to be open to considering that. But I cannot imagine people wanting a theologian to be a political leader in the United States. It's just so different from the way we tend to think about those categories, and may show up at different times in what we talk about.
Well, I think he did actually serve in the government in some role in that first administration after the Velvet Revolution. And remember, this is the Czech Republic. Their first post-communist president was a poet and playwright, Václav Havel. So they have something different going on in the Czech Republic. I don't know.
Yes.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned, these first 2 chapters in the book, I really see actually the first 4 chapters as being various dimensions of his introduction to his topic. And the first chapter in particular, introducing the topic more specifically, as he titles it, Love, Where From, Where To, and the subtitle of the book, of course, On the God of Love. And then the second chapter, I think he introduces us a bit more to his method, to the way he thinks about doing theology. So just to say a word about chapter 1 and this title of the chapter, I think he's chosen his chapter titles really carefully. So the love where from, that where from is really, I think, his big question. He's asking, perhaps in his European context, with this communist Czechoslovakian cultural background, where does goodness come from? And what's its ultimate source? That's his question. What's its ultimate source? And how does that strike you as a question? I mean, on the one hand, it seems kind of obvious, but he's making it a big question.
Yeah, I love that he's doing that. If I remember right, he situates it in the midst of questions about where evil comes from, and suggests that in the midst of what feels like evil all around us and challenge all around us, we could equally ask, where does good come from? And I also love that he goes on to talk about the way in which, as a priest and a theologian, people are going to expect him to come around and answer that question as, well, of course, God is the source of love. And ultimately, he doesn't seem to disagree with that, but he also wants to problematize it and make us think more deeply.
There's one of your seminary words. What do people mean when they say they want to problematize?
Oh gosh, yeah, fair enough. I think he really wants to make it more complicated than that. He doesn't want us to say, oh God, and then just kind of be done with that question. Instead, he thinks that asking where love comes from seems to be something like asking who God is, or whether God makes sense to us, which is really helpful, I think.
Yeah, and he points out along the way there that it's important to remember that goodness, and even the question about goodness, is a gift. This is not necessarily something that springs from inside of us. But that goodness in any way is a gift. I'm reminded of Genesis 1, where God creates, and God looks at the creation, and God says it's good. And remember, it's God speaking that actually brings things into existence. So when God says that it's good, does that also mean that God is creating its goodness with that word, and therefore thinking of goodness as a gift? Well, then there's the question of the where to that he asks. And there he's, I think, much clearer about what he understands, that the where to of love, the object of love, the direction in which love points, is toward a unification, and not in a simplistic kind of sense, and certainly not in an overbearing sense. He quotes Teilhard de Chardin in what I think is, I haven't actually seen this quote before, but I'm going to use it a lot moving forward, that love is the only force that can make things one without destroying them. And if we think about a lot of the political systems and the isms and the ideologies of the last 150 years that have tried to take us to utopia, or tried to make everything one, so often the only way they could do that was by destroying something that didn't fit, or ultimately ending up destroying pretty much the whole. So that his goal is for love, he sees as being that unification, but a unification that sustains and upbuilds, that doesn't destroy.
Yeah, that all sounds right to me. I don't have a lot to add on that particular point. I read it the same way.
Cool. So. Good deal. Well, I think one of the questions I think we can ask as we consider this chapter, and I'll be really interested to hear how the folks in the discussion have read the chapter and what they've picked up from it, And then I'm going to be curious about reactions to this question. It's on the handout that we're going to share. What does it mean for us to be looking for a path or a journey rather than an answer or a destination? It goes back to what you said about the way he talks about goodness. Of course, goodness comes from God, but that's not an answer to sit on. That's a journey to begin. And I think that's what he does with chapter 1.
I think that's right. He sets us up for that. It's reminiscent of Jesus saying, "I am the way," right? Yeah. It's a similar way of thinking about faith as a journey, where even that tempted to think, oh, so Jesus is the way, but no, as we'll see so clearly, he doesn't want to jump to that kind of simple answer either.
Yeah. Cool. Good.
Yeah, I don't want to sort of short circuit that question by trying to answer it, because I think it will be really great to hear what folks are thinking about how we make sense of finding a journey rather than a destination, and a question rather than an answer.
Cool. Good deal. Well, before we lose them from this video, because it's going on so long, because we have so much fun with this, let's get to chapter 2.
Yes, let's do it.
Which I think is more the introduction to his method. He calls it waiting for the second word. And I just love that image and the way that he develops it. He builds on chapter 1 in a sense, because he says that since we're on a journey, there really isn't any point at which any word is the final word. It's like no step in the journey is the last step, because the journey goes on and on and on. And so when we hear a word from God, for example, then he says, well, wait for the second word. Don't settle for just that word.
Yeah, and what I hear you saying that's helpful, Peter, is even as we wait for the second word, by inviting us not to stop on any particular word, it's not as if we're waiting for the second word and then stopping there either.
Yeah.
I'm reminded actually of this next piece on the handout about Jesus's quotation of my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Yeah.
And he talks about how that comes from Psalm 22, which I imagine many of us are familiar, at least on some level, in the depths of our memory or whatnot. Or, oh yeah, I've heard that.
Went to seminary.
Yeah, perhaps. And I can remember in seminary talking about that very thing and being pushed by a professor when I said, well, wait a minute, isn't Jesus quoting Psalm 22 there, which ends on a positive note? Does Jesus really think God has forsaken him? To which that professor responded, well, just because that's where the psalm goes doesn't mean that in that moment Jesus isn't experiencing some kind of deep forsakenness by God that's real, and that we have to be honest about and wrestle with all on its own. And I think we could add to that even that second part of the psalm that does point towards some kind of reunion is not meant, especially for life as we experience it right now, to be some kind of resolution to that forsakenness. Instead, it's more of an always changing and shifting relationship and dynamic.
Wait, you mean when I can take my mask off and be back with people and hug them and sing out loud in church with them, that won't be the answer to everything? I'll actually have to still figure out how to live life?
I think that's right. As much as we might hope that solves all our relational problems, I'm sure we'll still find plenty of difficulties and challenges there.
Yeah. The other thing about that word of Jesus on the cross that I so appreciate is Halik's sort of retranslation of it. So it's not why have you forsaken me, like done deal, you've forsaken me, what the heck? But rather it's for what purpose have you abandoned me? And that also the sense of journey, that you're still in a journey with God. What, you thought God was going to go away? Seriously? God was going to go away? No. And this is part of Halik's great foundational perspective, I think, that when he says that this era in which we live of God seeming to be absent from culture, even that absence is a word of God. God is still there. And if Jesus cries out, my God, for what purpose have you abandoned me? It's not that God has simply disappeared, but there's something in this with which God is still working, even if God is working behind or through a cross.
Yeah, I think it's great insight into where Halik wants us to go with this. And honestly, I didn't understand it as well until you said that. So I appreciate it and think other folks will too.
Good deal. Good deal. All right. Well, so we're waiting for the second word. And this great example that Halik gives is of Jesus hanging on the cross. And, you know, you can't get a deeper, more profound image of suffering and distress and disillusionment and disruption and disaster. And this sounds like a really useful, helpful word to hear when you're in the midst of that sense of abandonment or collapse. One of the things that it raises for me, though, it's the question on the handout, is how do we translate that, or how do we use this insight about waiting for the second word when we're just living life, so to speak, normally in the customary course of things, when I have to plan for my retirement, and when you have to be saving. Don't take this as an accusation, but you've heard people tell you have to be saving for your kids' college education already. They're what, 3 and 1?
Exactly. Yeah.
But you're probably too late saving for their college education. It seems to me that as we think about living the normal course of life and being responsible human beings, this idea of, well, I'm not quite sure what God's yet going to do with my life, could be a really sort of absurd or incomprehensible idea. And I wonder how we work with it, not in the moments of disruption, but when life is pretty stable.
Yeah, I mean, and I think part of that too, to your point, is that while in a way Halik uses this whole idea to invite us to dwell in those momentary experiences of disaster, I think much of the reality of our present day is that sometimes that feeling of malaise, as some have called it, of just kind of feeling down or disconnected or without direction, maybe, can just persist. It can just sort of sit there under the surface in a more continuous way. And so if other sociologists of religion and faith and society, if they're right about that, and Halik seems to think they are, then how does this idea of waiting for the second word help us to make sense of that experience when there's a way in which it feels like we're always waiting for that second word?
That's interesting. Yeah.
And so I'll be curious. My sense is that that's part of what Halik wants to bring us through in the rest of the book. But I think having some conversation about it up front will help us be more prepared to engage that deeply.
Great. Super. So just a word before we close here about our final note on the handout, that as we have discovered reading further into the book, and as others either have discovered because they're ahead of us in our reading or they will discover, Halik is a person who is incredibly well-read, well-educated. He has a broad background. As I noted on the handout, we've probably heard him refer to 10 or 12 thinkers from how many different eras of life. And that can feel like an obstacle. Oh, he quotes Kierkegaard. Oh, he quotes Hegel. Oh, he quotes Augustine. Oh, he quotes Miloš Kundera. And we go, well, wait a minute, I don't know what that person thinks. What else is he referring to here when he quotes that name? And I know as we've talked about it, Hayden, we've just wanted to be really clear that as we read the book, most of the time, you can kind of just read right past those names. If you don't know that person, if you don't recognize that name or that school of thought, it really doesn't matter, because Halik goes ahead and tells you what he's thinking or what he's using from that source. And so it's like, just go with what he gives you. I do mention this reference to another word game on page 15, and the linguistic turn in philosophy, in 20th century philosophy, blah, 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 because that might be helpful to realize that when he says word game, he actually has a very technical notion in mind there. And where that's crucial, where we feel that's crucial, we'll be providing a little bit of background on the handout or in these video conversations to fill in some of those blanks. And certainly if there are questions about those things that people wonder about, that can become part of our discussion. But up front, we just need to say that the style of his writing as an academic and as someone who's in the conversation with other theologians and philosophers who are going to work on a daily basis with these reference points, that doesn't need to be an obstacle to our reading the book. He writes really well if you learn how to kind of read through all of those references.
So Peter, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Are you saying as a leader that I don't need to pretend that I've read Kierkegaard or have any idea who Teilhard de Chardin is? Is that right?
That's right. That's right. What you need to know about Teilhard de Chardin is... Thank you. What you need to know, and by the way, those of us who know him well, we all just call him Teilhard.
Oh, good.
What you need to know about him, Halik gives you. He gives you
Yes.
that great quote, and
exactly.
It could have come off a subway wall or the staircase on the L in Chicago. I don't care. It's the quote that he wants you to get.
Yes.
His mentioning that it comes from Teilhard is for one part of his audience. The vast majority of that part of his audience are not in our discussion group, so we don't all have to worry about it or pretend that we do.
Yeah, and I want to lift up one more thing that you named in an early email about this book discussion, Peter, which is that Halik is as much interested in our life questions and life experiences as anything else. So that's really where we want our discussion to go. And we help these conversations just help us do that rather than muddle things even more. So I'm excited to just share about how our life experiences mesh up with all that Halik's describing, because I think if we allow ourselves to be a little vulnerable and a little honest about that, we'll find we have plenty to talk about.
Yeah. And let's keep each other honest, Hayden, as we go through alternately preparing these handouts and taking leadership, so that the questions that we ask about the chapters are not technical questions about what happened in this chapter. That's a test question for school. We want, what's the life issue that Halik is addressing here? That's a discussion question for a good group conversation.
Exactly. Well, if you're watching, I'm looking so forward to talking about the book together, and thanks for jumping into this with us.